They said she was the most brilliant woman in Rome, beautiful, witty, beloved, the very image of her father's dreams. But on a humid summer night in 2 BCE, the daughter of Emperor Augustus was dragged through the marble corridors of the Palatine, her bare feet echoing on the stone. Her jewels had been torn away, her hair unbound. Outside, in the torch-lit courtyard, soldiers waited beside a covered litter. No one spoke her name aloud. Even the guards avoided her gaze. The people of Rome had adored her. They had thrown petals beneath her chariot when she appeared beside her father during the games, cheering for the woman who was to be the mother of the empire's future. Yet now, that same city whispered that she was cursed, that she had defied the emperor's sacred laws of chastity and turned the house of Caesar into a brothel. What they did not know was this: Julia's fall was not the scandal of a reckless woman. It was the carefully staged destruction of a rival, a political purge disguised as moral justice. Augustus did not merely exile his daughter for sin. He exiled her for power. Rome glittered beneath a haze of summer dust, its temples white as bone and its alleys humming with the noise of victory. The civil wars were over. Augustus had built his peace upon blood and marble. Statues of him stood in every forum, every shrine, proclaiming the birth of a new golden age. And in the middle of this carefully balanced world stood his only child, Julia, the living symbol of dynasty and renewal. She had been born into triumph and calculation. When she was still in swaddling clothes, senators offered sacrifices for her health, as if the future of the empire depended on her tiny heartbeat. Augustus adored her, yet guarded her like a state secret. Her tutors drilled her in Greek philosophy, poetry, and the precise rhetoric that could sway a senate. She learned to speak with the calm authority of a ruler and the charm of a poet. But behind the discipline, there flickered an intelligence too quick to be contained. She questioned, she teased, she laughed, not the demure giggle expected of a Roman maiden, but a bright, reckless laugh that made old men blink and young ones dream. At 14, she was married, as was the custom for daughters of emperors. Her husband, Marcellus, was barely 16, handsome and promising, and Augustus's chosen heir. Their marriage was the empire's insurance policy. Yet Julia, though obedient, felt the trap from the start. Rome adored the young couple. Poets compared them to Aeneas and Lavinia, the rebirth of Trojan virtue. But within 2 years, Marcellus was dead, struck down by fever, or by politics, depending on who told the story. Julia mourned him publicly, privately sensing that grief in Rome was always a performance. Her father, needing new alliances, married her again, this time to his friend in general, Marcus Agrippa, a man twice her age and rough from war. Agrippa had built Augustus's victories. He was the blunt instrument that kept peace in place. Julia, radiant and articulate, was the ornament to display that peace. Together, they were the perfect propaganda. To everyone's surprise, their marriage worked, at least in public. Agrippa admired her wit, and Julia, recognizing decency when she saw it, gave him children dutifully, 5 in total. 2 destined to be heirs. She hosted dinners where philosophers debated stoicism and poets recited verses beneath painted ceilings. The empire's elite courted her favor, sensing that through her ran the bloodline of power. But Augustus's world was one of appearances, and appearances required obedience. As the emperor grew older, he became obsessed with morality, with laws that could sculpt the soul of Rome into his image. He banished men for adultery, forced senators to marry, and decreed that women who strayed should lose half their dowries. It was said that he wanted to make the city virtuous by decree. Yet even as he preached chastity, Julia's salons glowed with laughter long after midnight. She read the new edicts with wry amusement. "My father," she joked to a friend, "has made adultery illegal. I wonder whom he plans to arrest first, the poets or the gods?" The remark was repeated across Rome within a day. Humor, in the age of Augustus, was sedition dressed in wit. When Agrippa died suddenly in 12 BCE, the city mourned a soldier, and Augustus mourned the partner who had kept his empire intact. Julia mourned something else, the fragile shelter that had protected her from her father's expectations. At 27, she was widowed, celebrated, and more valuable than ever as a political asset. Augustus, determined to tighten control, forced her into another marriage, this time to his stepson Tiberius, the son of Livia. Tiberius was everything she was not: severe, silent, uncomfortable with joy. He loved another woman, Vipsania, whom he had been forced to divorce to marry Julia. Their wedding was cold, their union colder. At dinners he sat apart, eyes fixed on the table, while Julia held court with poets, generals, and scholars. The empire's elite courted her favor, sensing that through her ran the bloodline of power. But Augustus's world was one of appearances, and appearances required obedience. As the emperor grew older, he became obsessed with morality, with laws that could sculpt the soul of Rome into his image. He banished men for adultery, forced senators to marry, and decreed that women who strayed should lose half their dowries. It was said that he wanted to make the city virtuous by decree. Yet even as he preached chastity, Julia's salons glowed with laughter long after midnight. She read the new edicts with wry amusement. "My father," she joked to a friend, "has made adultery illegal. I wonder whom he plans to arrest first, the poets or the gods?" The remark was repeated across Rome within a day. Humor, in the age of Augustus, was sedition dressed in wit. When Agrippa died suddenly in 12 BCE, the city mourned a soldier, and Augustus mourned the partner who had kept his empire intact. Julia mourned something else, the fragile shelter that had protected her from her father's expectations. At 27, she was widowed, celebrated, and more valuable than ever as a political asset. Augustus, determined to tighten control, forced her into another marriage, this time to his stepson Tiberius, the son of Livia. Tiberius was everything she was not: severe, silent, uncomfortable with joy. He loved another woman, Vipsania, whom he had been forced to divorce to marry Julia. Their wedding was cold, their union colder. At dinners he sat apart, eyes fixed on the table, while Julia held court with poets, generals, and scholars. The empire's elite courted her favor, sensing that through her ran the bloodline of power. But Augustus's world was one of appearances, and appearances required obedience. As the emperor grew older, he became obsessed with morality, with laws that could sculpt the soul of Rome into his image. He banished men for adultery, forced senators to marry, and decreed that women who strayed should lose half their dowries. It was said that he wanted to make the city virtuous by decree. Yet even as he preached chastity, Julia's salons glowed with laughter long after midnight.
She read the new edicts with wry amusement. "My father," she joked to a friend, "has made adultery illegal. I wonder whom he plans to arrest first, the poets or the gods?" The remark was repeated across Rome within a day. Humor, in the age of Augustus, was sedition dressed in wit. When Agrippa died suddenly in 12 BCE, the city mourned a soldier, and Augustus mourned the partner who had kept his empire intact. Julia mourned something else, the fragile shelter that had protected her from her father's expectations. At 27, she was widowed, celebrated, and more valuable than ever as a political asset. Augustus, determined to tighten control, forced her into another marriage, this time to his stepson Tiberius, the son of Livia. Tiberius was everything she was not: severe, silent, uncomfortable with joy. He loved another woman, Vipsania, whom he had been forced to divorce to marry Julia. Their wedding was cold, their union colder. At dinners he sat apart, eyes fixed on the table, while Julia held court with poets, generals, and scholars. The empire's elite courted her favor, sensing that through her ran the bloodline of power. But Augustus's world was one of appearances, and appearances required obedience. As the emperor grew older, he became obsessed with morality, with laws that could sculpt the soul of Rome into his image. He banished men for adultery, forced senators to marry, and decreed that women who strayed should lose half their dowries. It was said that he wanted to make the city virtuous by decree. Yet even as he preached chastity, Julia's salons glowed with laughter long after midnight. She read the new edicts with wry amusement. "My father," she joked to a friend, "has made adultery illegal. I wonder whom he plans to arrest first, the poets or the gods?" The remark was repeated across Rome within a day. Humor, in the age of Augustus, was sedition dressed in wit. When Agrippa died suddenly in 12,
the wind off the Tyrrhenian Sea was knife-cold the morning Julia stepped onto the shore of Panditaria, a barren island that seemed more a punishment carved from rock than a place meant for human life. The waves clawed endlessly at the cliffs, flinging salt into her face as she climbed the narrow path toward the crumbling villa that would serve as her prison. The guards said nothing, their armor clinked with the rhythm of chains. She could taste iron on the air, the same taste that had filled her mouth when she'd been dragged from her bed in Rome. Once she had walked beneath marble arches while crowds shouted her name. Now gulls screamed above her like the ghosts of those she'd loved. The villa itself was bleak. Rooms stripped bare, walls sweating with sea mist, the furniture worn by generations of the disgraced. Julia stood in the doorway, listening to the wind moan through the cracks, and for the first time she felt the weight of silence, the silence of a world that had chosen to forget her. She had no mirrors, no scrolls, no music. Only the ocean, her own breath, and the ache of memory. At night she lay awake on a narrow cot, the surf pounding below like the drumbeat of an army that never stopped marching. She thought of Iulus Antonius, and the way his hand had trembled slightly when he quoted Virgil to her, the warmth of his voice, the last thing she heard before the world collapsed. They said he had taken his own life on her father's orders. She refused to believe it until she dreamed of him standing on the shore calling her name. The dream broke her open. She began to write by the dim light of a tallow lamp, scratching verses onto scraps of parchment. Poems of love, defiance, longing. The guards confiscated most, but one old servant risked his life to smuggle a few to the mainland. "He writes like a flame that will not die," he told those who read them. Word of those secret poems spread through Rome, whispered in markets and taverns. The people began to pity her, then to question the emperor who had preached mercy yet shown none to his own child.
Augustus, hearing of this, forbade even her name to be spoken in public. Her statues were toppled, her likeness scraped from coins. To the world, Julia ceased to exist. On the island, the seasons blurred. Winters howled with storms that smashed boats against the cliffs. Summers baked the rocks until they split. Julia grew thin, her hair bleached by sun and salt, but her mind remained fierce. She studied the sea's moods as if it were a living thing plotting escape with her. She trained her eyes to read the horizon, to imagine Rome just beyond it. Sometimes fishermen landed secretly to trade food for her words. Once a letter arrived in secret, unsigned, but she knew the handwriting. It was from her stepmother Livia, cold, precise, almost pitying. "Your father suffers. You have wounded the image of the gods he built." Julia laughed until tears ran down her face. "Tell him," she whispered, "that the gods are lonelier than I am." That night a storm hit so violent it tore the roof from part of the villa. The guards huddled in fear, while Julia stood outside drenched, her arms raised as lightning shredded the sky. For a heartbeat she felt powerful again, the sea answering her fury. But when morning came, she was exhausted, her knees bruised, her body trembling. She realized then that her father had achieved something worse than death. He had taught her to live without hope. Years passed. The emperor grew old, new scandals replaced the old. Rome forgot. Yet within the hearts of women who heard her story, she became legend, the princess who loved too much, who defied the laws written by men pretending to be gods. Even Tiberius, now heir, could not erase her completely. From his palace, he received reports that the exiles of Panditaria spoke her name in prayer, believing that her suffering could intercede with the divine. The irony would have pleased her. When word finally reached her that her father might pardon her, years too late, when her beauty had faded and her spirit worn thin, she simply looked out to sea and said, "He remembers me now that I can no longer threaten him." She died quietly soon after, the exact day lost to history. Some claim she starved herself, others said illness took her. The guards buried her on the cliffs overlooking the water, the same water that had mirrored her exile for so long. But fishermen later told of seeing a pale figure walking the shore at dusk, her hair loose, her face calm at last, watching the sunset over the empire that once had been hers. Rome, they said, never glowed more beautifully than on the night the emperor's daughter was freed from its chains.
In Rome, the air itself seemed to change after Julia's banishment. The city that had once chanted her name grew muted, as if ashamed of the echo. Markets bustled, senators debated, legions marched, yet an invisible shadow lay across the marble. Augustus, the master of order, had torn a thread from his own fabric of perfection, and no decree could mend it. He returned to his palace on the Palatine and forbade her name to be spoken. But names have a way of lingering. In private, servants whispered that the emperor no longer slept. He walked the halls at night in silence, staring at the altars he had built to the gods of virtue, as though waiting for them to absolve him. Livia watched from a distance, calm as marble. She had never liked Julia's laughter, her quicksilver charm that drew men like moths to flame. Now she saw the balance of power tilting her way. Tiberius, her son, had been summoned home from Rhodes, where he had brooded in self-imposed exile since the scandal. He returned gaunt, cold-eyed, suspicious of everyone. When he stood before Augustus to receive forgiveness, the emperor barely recognized the boy he had once groomed as heir. "Rome is quieter now," Tiberius said, his voice like frost. "Even the gods approve." Augustus said nothing. He saw in Tiberius not a son, but the embodiment of necessity, control without warmth, obedience without love. Yet he needed him. The death of Julia's children, Gaius and Lucius, once heirs of empire, had already begun to unravel the succession.
Fate, as if conspiring, was erasing every trace of her bloodline. The empire would survive, but the family that founded it was dying from within. Each festival that once had been Julia's domain felt hollow. The Vestal virgins walked in procession through the forum, their white veils glowing, and Augustus felt a stab of memory so sharp he almost faltered. He saw Julia at 17, radiant on the temple steps, offering sacrifice to Vesta while the crowd cheered. Now that vision clung to him like perfume from a ghost. He asked the poets to write verses about loyalty, purity, and the triumph of moral reform. Ovid's words still lingered like a wound. His Ars Amatoria, which Julia had once quoted in jest, now banned, its author exiled. But exile, Augustus discovered, was a form of haunting. The farther he sent those who defied him, the more vividly they lived in his imagination. Livia's influence deepened. She organized the imperial household with precision, removing servants who had shown sympathy for Julia, rewriting the palace's private records, ensuring that history itself bent towards obedience. She would tell Augustus softly, "The empire must see only your strength, never your regret." He would nod, though her words cut him deeper. In public, he performed serenity. In private, he read Julia's old letters until the ink blurred. One, written when she was a child, ended with the line, "When I grow up, I will make you proud." That night, the emperor who ruled the world wept alone. Meanwhile, the people began to romanticize the fallen princess. In taverns and tenements, women named their daughters Julia again, defying the law that forbade it. Street performers sang verses about a woman too bright for the cage of Rome. The moral laws Augustus had written, the Lex Julia, became the subject of mockery. He exiled his own child for breaking them, someone would mutter, and others would lower their voices, glancing at the ever-watchful Praetorians. Yet the murmurs grew. Rome's conscience was shifting. Tiberius, sensing the change, withdrew again to Capri, muttering that the city was poisoned by nostalgia. Livia maintained order with an iron smile. She destroyed the last letters Julia had sent, claiming they were blasphemous. But one servant, risking death, hid a single scrap. "If I cannot live as myself, I shall live in the memories they cannot erase." That scrap would surface centuries later, fragile but defiant. By the time Augustus lay dying, his empire stretched from Spain to Syria. The world bowed to his name, but the silence in his palace was unbearable. He asked once for news of his daughter. The courtiers hesitated. She was alive, they told him, though thinner, frailer, forgotten. "Alive," he repeated, as if the word itself hurt. Then he whispered, "Would that I had never married her mother." Livia stood beside him, unmoved. She said, "You built Rome from ashes, and ashes are the price of empire." When Augustus finally died, the Senate proclaimed him divine, the father of the nation. Statues rose, temples gleamed, and his name became a prayer. But among the people, another legend lived, the story of his brilliant daughter, exiled for love, who had defied gods and men alike. In that legend, she was the true immortal. When Augustus died, the empire mourned a god and inherited a ghost. The Senate declared him divine, his image carved into marble temples across the provinces. But in the quiet rooms of power, there was only unease. Tiberius now wore the purple cloak, heavy with his stepfather's shadow. Rome had gained an emperor, but lost its illusion of virtue. The moral empire Augustus had built, laws of chastity, of order, of patriarchal control, was cracking beneath the weight of hypocrisy. Julia still lived, though no one dared speak her name. Hidden now, not on Pandateria, but on the mainland at Rhegium, she was a relic the new emperor preferred to forget. Her health had withered. Her hair, once gold as the Tiber at dusk, had turned pale and brittle.
The sea still haunted her dreams, its endless rhythm echoing the years of her isolation. Each morning she walked the narrow garden between her quarters and the cliffs, the guards pretending not to watch. She no longer wrote letters. The last attempt had ended with punishment, the confiscation of her servant, the one soul who had kept her company since Panditaria. She learned to speak only with silence, to measure her days by the changing tides. From time to time, rumors reached her like driftwood. Augustus's apotheosis, Livia's growing power, Tiberius's withdrawal from public life. The world she had once animated had become theater without an audience. She was its missing music. At night, she whispered to herself the names of her children: Gaius, Lucius, Agrippina, Julia the Younger, Posthumus, each a ghost carried by memory. Most were gone now, swallowed by illness or politics. The dynasty her father had sacrificed her to preserve was dissolving, a bloodline eating itself alive. She wondered if he had known that would happen, if exile had ever truly been about morality, or if she had simply been one more offering to the gods of empire. In Rome, Tiberius ruled with suspicion instead of grace. He distrusted everyone: senators, generals, even the statues that seemed to watch him in the forum. His mother, Livia, governed behind the veil, whispering through courtiers, controlling his temper, manipulating decrees. The empire that had once been lit by Julia's laughter now echoed with whispers and fear. Trials multiplied, informers thrived. The poets were silent. The city that had called itself eternal felt brittle, as if time itself had turned against it. Yet the people remembered. When they prayed to Augustus's shrine, many left flowers not at the altar of the god, but secretly at the base, offerings for the daughter he had condemned. For Julia, the woman who loved too much. Guards reported it to the Senate, but even senators hesitated to punish devotion that came from the heart. On the island of Capri, where Tiberius built his retreats, the emperor would sometimes look toward the south and ask if she still lived. When told she did, he would nod curtly. Let her live then, and remember. It was the cruelest mercy of all. As the years passed, Julia's strength faded, but her clarity sharpened. She saw, with the brutal calm of the forgotten, the truth of empire, that it was not built on virtue but on performance, not on justice but on survival. She saw her father's face in her mind's eye, not the emperor but the man, weary and frightened of losing control, and felt at last a flicker of pity. He was trapped too, she murmured to the wind one evening, watching the sky burn orange over the sea. He built a cage and called it peace. The end came quietly. A winter storm sealed the roads, supplies stopped arriving. The guards grew thin and desperate. Julia, refusing food, spent her final days wrapped in a worn cloak, staring at the horizon. One morning they found her seated by the window, eyes open, a faint smile on her lips, as if she had seen something just beyond sight. A return, perhaps, or release. She was 52. No triumphs marked her passing, no funeral pyre on the field of Mars. The woman who had once been the heart of Rome was buried in obscurity, her grave unmarked to prevent worship. Yet even that decree failed. Years later, pilgrims began leaving wildflowers on the cliffs where she had last walked. Fishermen claimed that when the sea was calm, a light glimmered there at dusk, as if a lantern burned beneath the waves. Some said it was the reflection of her soul, refusing to fade. In the capital, Livia outlived them all. She died praised as the model of Roman womanhood, her intrigues rewritten as wisdom. But among those who remembered,
Her name carried the chill of calculation. Tiberius died bitter, haunted by nightmares of his stepfather's children, and the empire passed to Caligula, Julia's grandson, a reminder that even exile cannot sever blood. In that strange twist of history, the daughter Augustus had tried to erase became the grandmother of the emperors who would define and defile his legacy. The empire endured, but its innocence was buried with her on a forgotten shore. In the centuries that followed, chroniclers called her Julia the Elder, as though distance could tame her story. They reduced her to scandal, to footnote, to cautionary tale. But beneath the moral judgment, her spirit remained, restless, luminous, defiant. To those who read between the lines, she was never merely the sinner they described, but the truth-teller the empire feared. And in the end, that was her triumph. Not the power she lost, but the humanity she kept when gods and emperors forgot what that meant.
Centuries later, the marble of Rome still gleamed in the sun, but the empire it reflected was no longer the world Julia had known. Her name, once erased, had become legend, her story reshaped by each generation that dared whisper it. To some, she was the fallen daughter of a god, punished for desire. To others, she was the soul of the empire, its conscience, its warning, its sorrow. Even the emperors who came long after could not entirely silence her ghost. In their dreams, she walked the marble halls, laughing softly, the sound echoing like memory through time. After her death, the tide of politics rolled on, sweeping away the men who had condemned her. Livia's statues crumbled under later emperors who saw her ambition for what it was. Tiberius, isolated and tormented on Capri, muttered her name in his final delirium. "Julia," he whispered, "forgive me," though whether he begged forgiveness for his cruelty or his weakness, none could tell. The Senate burned incense to the divine Augustus, but the people left flowers for Julia. She had become the empire's unspoken prayer. May the gods remember mercy where men do not. When her grandson Caligula rose to power, he ordered the restoration of her memory. Statues of the exiled princess were raised again in Rome, her name recarved onto altars, her story told anew as proof of imperial clemency. But even that gesture was tainted by madness. Caligula's Rome was a theater of cruelty, its virtue a mockery. Yet, in a twisted way, his act returned her to history. Where Augustus had tried to erase, his blood restored. In the imperial archives, scribes once again copied her name, their quills scratching softly through the night. It was as though the city itself had decided she would not be forgotten. Time transformed her tragedy into parable. Philosophers spoke of her exile as the moment Rome lost its innocence. Poets called her the flame that outlived the fire. And among women, her legend became an inheritance, a story passed from mother to daughter, of the woman who had dared to love in an age that worshipped restraint. The moralists still used her as a warning, "Be not like Julia, lest you fall," but their caution only made her shine brighter in the imagination. To young girls trapped in arranged marriages, she became a symbol of defiance. To scholars centuries later, a mirror reflecting the contradictions of power and virtue. In the crumbling libraries of Byzantium, a monk once wrote in the margin of Suetonius's account, "Perhaps she was not wicked,
but free. That line, small and daring, would outlive empires. Even the ruins remember her. On the island where she died, fragments of mosaic still gleam beneath the grass, bits of blue and gold that once paved her floor. Fishermen still speak of a light that moves across the waves on quiet nights, as if someone walks upon the water carrying a lamp. They say it is the spirit of a woman searching for home. When the wind rises, it carries the faint sound of laughter, too distant to be real, too clear to be forgotten. What makes her story endure is not her fall, but what it revealed. Julia's life was a mirror held up to Rome itself, its hypocrisy, its hunger for perfection, its fear of truth. She had been raised to embody virtue and punished for being human. Her father's empire claimed to be eternal, but she had exposed its fragility. The empire could conquer nations, but it could not conquer the heart. That was her rebellion, her crime, her immortality. When historians centuries later would count the reign of Augustus, they wrote of temples, of roads, of peace. But in the margins, in the quiet spaces where truth hides, they always returned to her, to the brilliant daughter exiled for love. Because history, for all its marble and monuments, remembers feeling more than power. And in that measure, Julia triumphed. So, when you walk the ruins of Rome and hear the wind whisper through broken columns, listen closely. You may hear her voice, soft, defiant, still alive in the dust of empire, saying what she could never say to her father. I was never your shame. I was your mirror.